He didn't leave in anger. He left with a delay. No goodbye message. No explosion. No announcement. Just a slow refusal to keep showing up in places that kept shrinking him. There's no ceremony when you fade like that. One day, you're in the group photo. The next, you're not even tagged. His name was still on the record, but his body has stopped clocking in. Every room became harder to walk into. Every handshake felt like proof he couldn't give. He told himself he'd return after he rested, after he figured it out, and after he felt like himself again. That is how you disappear without dying. Stop explaining, you stop correcting them, and let the absence speak for you. It wasn't official. There was no form, no meeting, no warning. One week, he just didn't show up. Next, he kept not showing up. And eventually, no one asked if he still belonged. There are many ways to collapse. Some look like crying in public, others look like eating alone in the hallway, then skipping the next class. He kept telling himself it was temporary, that he'd bounce back, that this was just a phase. But every semester, the page stayed blank. Every time he sat down to begin again, his chest tightened. He wasn't depressed, he was just no longer convinced he could survive the version of him they wanted. The school gave him a locker, top row, end of the hallway. He never opened it once. He walked past it every day. Sometimes he stopped, leaned on it, and pretended to adjust his bag, but he never turned the dial. Something about it felt final, like if he used it, he was agreeing to stay. So, he let it stay locked, and in some strange way, that became a choice not to belong, not to commit, not to pretend. Years later, he would think about that locker, about how strange it was to have something assigned for himself, yet feel like it was never his to open. When someone disappears quietly, the world rarely notices. There is no headline for walking out of your own life in slow motion, no applause for declining invitations, skipping class, or letting your name fade from the list. Yet, this form of collapse is more common than we admit. Most people don't fall with spectacle, they fade. Think about history. Whole empires have collapsed not through sudden invasion, but through corrosion, a slow refusal to sustain what no longer carries meaning. Rome didn't burn in a night, its citizens withdrew piece by piece until there was nothing left to hold them together. Private collapse works the same way. On the outside, it may appear to be laziness or disinterest. Inside, it's a strategic retreat from the structure that no longer fits. Psychology tells us that withdrawal is not always weakness. Sometimes it's the nervous system recalibrating, cutting off unnecessary exposure to survive the pressure. A student stops showing up, not because they're incapable, but because every appearance feels like trespassing on a life they can't sustain. That's not drama, that's self preservation. But there's a tension. Collapse in private often leaves no witnesses, no validation, which means the person must decide if their exit was escape or transformation. Did they vanish to avoid the weight? Or did they vanish to rebuild it differently? The answer shapes everything that follows. Even in strategy, retreat is not always defeat. Generals from Sun Tzu to Napoleon used withdrawal to reset the field. To collapse in private can be a way of burning the full story, so a sharper one can be drawn. But that's only true if the collapse leads to recalibration, not permanent hiding. So, the question isn't whether someone collapses. Everyone collapses. The question is, when you vanish, do you do it to escape yourself or to return as someone the old room can no longer contain? It didn't feel like a place to grow. It felt like a place to wait. He wasn't failing, but he wasn't building anything either. Lectures blurred. The hallway conversations felt like reruns of someone else's show. He walked from class to class as if he were doing a job that never told him to pay. At first, he blamed himself, too distracted, too distant, too tired. But deep down, he knew the problem wasn't energy. It meant something. He wasn't learning how to move forward. He was learning how to stay still in a way that looked productive. That's how the trap works. You look busy, but your story doesn't shift. The things that broke him never showed up in the syllabus. The real lessons happen when no one is checking attendance, no test for being left behind, no assignment for hearing them laugh and knowing it's about you, no grading sheet for how many times you had to show up with no sleep, no help, and no one noticing. There are other lessons too: how to smile while defending yourself, how to write a paper while shaking from the conversation you didn't expect, how to pretend you're fine just long enough to leave the room. None of it made it onto the transcript, but it shaped everything that followed. They'll say school prepares you for the real world, but if you already lived it, you know. She was the only one. He let close enough to see the cracks. It wasn't dramatic. No fight, no name calling, no closure. She just started replying slower, stopped asking, stopped waiting. And he let her because he didn't know how to explain the version of him he had become. Not bitter, not angry, just not able to carry someone else's weight while still holding his spine together. She didn't do anything wrong. She just reached the limit, and he respected it enough not to beg. Some people leave not because they don't care, but because they can carry what you can never get to unpack. Not all wounds are visible. Some don't leave marks, they leave patterns. The scar that doesn't bleed is the one that changes how you move without anyone seeing the cut. In schools, companies, and even families, they were told the visible test is the one that matters: grades, certificates, performance reviews, all the measurable markers of progress. But the real lessons, the one that shape identity, rarely get graded. Learning how to keep your voice steady when you're the punchline. Learning how to hold your ground when you walk into a room already dismissed. Learning how to keep working when exhaustion becomes your native language. None of this shows up on a transcript, yet these are the conditions that forge strategy. Psychology has a word for this: hidden curriculum. It's the unspoken rules and survival tactics that no one writes down, but everyone absorbs. The scar that doesn't bleed is what the hidden curriculum leaves behind. The permanent adjustment you make so you can move through hostile terrain without collapsing. History is full of examples. Consider soldiers who return from war zones. Their bodies may be intact, but their wiring is changed. They read every room differently, scan for exits, calculate risks, before others can even sense danger. They carry scars you can point to, but those scars dictate every choice. Or look at the leaders who endured exile or imprisonment. Mandela spent decades in confinement. He emerged not with open wounds, but with a scar that rewired his patience, his timing, and his ability to wait for the right moment to strike. The danger is this: when the scar doesn't bleed, outsiders assume you're fine. They don't see the fracture, so they misread your withdrawal as indifference. But those who carry the invisible scars knows the truth. Sometimes survival means keeping the wound hidden so you can keep functioning. Here's the shift worth noting. Scars don't only mark damage, they can mark adaptation. They remind you that you're already been broken in ways most people can't imagine. And because of that, you move differently, maybe slower, maybe sharper, but undeniably different. So, the real question is this: when life leaves you with scars no one can see, will you let them limit your range, or will you let them harden into a structure that carries you further than anyone expects? Some lessons don't come from books, they come from keeping your head down and your ears open. He learned how to stretch one meal into three, how to spot who would flake before they made a promise, how to walk like he belonged, even when he didn't. No one taught him how to survive campus politics, how to answer when they ask you why you look tired every day, how to pretend you understand the lecture when your brain is busy calculating what's left in your wallet. This wasn't self pity, it was self preservation. And if you're the kind of person who got through college without learning how to disappear inside a crowd, you were one of the lucky ones. Pretending takes more energy than people think. It's a constant calculation: how much to share, how much to hold back. By the time he got home, he wasn't exhausted from the workload. He was exhausted from the performance. He had to rehearse every answer, smile through enough to avoid a check in, sound engaged enough not to raise concern. People talk about burnout like it comes from too much work, but sometimes it comes from too much acting. And by the end, he wasn't breaking. He was just too tired to keep the show going. He didn't talk much about it, but it was there: a quiet kind of anger, not explosive, not loud, just heavy, like carrying something sharp in your coat pocket. He was angry that he had to be twice as composed, angry that showing pain made people uncomfortable, angry that most of what he built would never be seen because it didn't come with a certificate. He didn't lash out, he didn't burn bridges, but he did withdraw, not as revenge, but to carry his anger in a way that didn't cut the people who hadn't earned it. Some people vent, some explode. He built a structure around it. He called it growth. Survival doesn't always look like strength. Sometimes it seems like pretending, smiling when your chest is burning, nodding while your mind is counting coins, answering questions with rehearsed lines so no one asks again. That's what it meant to stay when you're already gone. Sociologists calls this surface acting, showing the version others expect while hiding the weight underneath. It's exhausting, more often draining than the actual workload. Because every day becomes performance, the cost isn't only time, the cost is identity. You begin to forget what your real face looks like. History shows the same pattern. In court and dynasties, survival often depend on the ability to perform loyalty while quietly holding escape plans. servants at Versailles, advisors in imperial courts, spies in wartime. They stayed in the room, but their minds lived elsewhere. Staying when you're already gone is not weakness, it's camouflage. But camouflage has its risks. The longer you wear the mask, the more you wonder if anything real is left beneath it. You became fluent in the word fine. You perfect the half smile that stops questions, and over time, you measure your worth not by truth, but by how well you keep the act alive. That's the danger, mistaking performance for resilience. Yet, there is strategy in this posture. Enduring without broadcasting collapse is a skill. It means you can hold shape in hostile ground. It means you can conserve energy until the right moment. It means you can exit clean without trails of noise. This is where survivors separate from performers. Performers collapse when the audience leaves. Survivors keep breathing even when no one is watching. So here's the tension. Staying when you're already gone works in the short term, but in the long term, it can erase you. The real test is not whether you can act, but whether you know when to stop acting and begin building. The question to live with is this: if you mastered the art of pretending, will you use it as armor until you're ready to strike? Or will you let it become the cage that convinces you the mask is all you are? Even in the brief days when he laughed, there's always something under the table, watching. Joy was never whole, only paused, like it was holding its breath until the next break. He didn't go to Japan to find himself. He went to escape the version of him that was falling apart. New city, new rules, new language. It felt like he had outpaced the damage. For a while, it was enough. Everything was foreign, so he didn't have to explain anything. No one asked where he'd been. No one cared what he spoke less. He became someone who didn't owe answers. But running is quite a workout. You only realize how much you packed when you sit down. And eventually, even the distance stops working. There's a kind of peace that feels fake if you're not used to it. He'd sit on clean cafes, order carefully, and take his time. No one stared, no one asked. But it wasn't comfort, it was detachment, wrapped in structure. Eating alone stopped feeling like freedom and started feeling like a default. The stillness wasn't healing, it was just easier than conflict. Some days, he thought he was better, but better isn't always whole. It just means the chaos is quiet enough to be ignored. Politeness doesn't always mean closeness. People bowed, smiled, helped, but he felt further from them than the ones who judged him back home. He didn't miss home, but started to miss the version of him that wanted to try. Here, he could vanish with ease, blend in, stay on the edge of every group, be friendly, but never attached. They didn't push, and that gave him space. But space also leaves room for nothing to grow. Japan didn't hurt him, but it didn't save him either. It just made it easier to hide the damage under better lighting. Running doesn't erase the weight you carry, It only buys time. Japan, in this chapter, wasn't the cure, it was distance. And distance can feel like healing when what you're escaping finally falls out of sight. But distance is temporary. Sooner or later, the weight catches up. Psychology has a word for this: avoidance coping. It's when the mind deals with pain by outrunning it, changing scenery, routines, people. At first, it works. New streets, new rituals, new voices mean you don't have to explain what broke you. But avoidance is not resolution, it's camouflage. And the pain that sleeps under better lighting is still alive. History proves this pattern. Exile has always been a tool of survival, but also of illusion. Writers, warriors, thinkers, many went abroad believing a change of country meant a change of self. Yet, when the crowd is gone and the noise is lowered, they find the same fracture waiting in the quiet. Japan was no different: politeness without closeness, order without connection, space without growth. The lesson here is sharp. Peace can be fake. It can feel like stability when it's only the absence of conflict. Eating alone, walking unnoticed, blending into new patterns. That looks like control, but it's often just a pause, and pauses don't heal, they only delay. But delay has its uses. Distance creates perspective. To live in another culture, to detach from old world, gives you time to see your damage with new eyes. Japan didn't heal him, but it gave him structure, a container to hold the chaos until he was strong enough to face it. And this is where strategy comes in. Not every escape is weakness. Sometimes escape is a reconnaissance. Sometimes you leave not just to fix yourself, but to scout the terrain, to test how much weight you can carry before it breaks through again. So, here's the question: when you find peace in a place that isn't home, do you accept it as healing, or do you recognize it as a pause, a temporary shield, not a cure? He came back without a plan. No welcome party, no fixed address. No one is waiting at the gate. It wasn't a return. It was more like continuing from a pause sentence no one remembered. The buildings were the same, but he wasn't. He didn't tell many people he was back. He didn't need to. There was a quiet kind of power in showing up without explaining, not out of pride, but because you already explained too much to people who never understood. There's no medal for returning when no one knew you were gone. No round of applause for continuing what everyone thought you abandoned. But still, you showed up to the small jobs, to the unpaid favors, to the classrooms he no longer believed in. Not because he believed in the system, but because part of him refused to give them the ending they expected. Some thought he failed, but he was just rebuilding in places they stopped looking. They wanted a version of him that was easier to define: graduate, dropout, reform. But he stayed between the lines, not by accident, by design. He didn't quit, he just stopped agreeing to the terms. Every day he returned was a small refusal, a quiet protest. Not against the rules, but against what they did to people like himself. And even if they never understood it, he knew the truth. He didn't owe them a story they could approve of. There is no ceremony in returning when no one noticed you were gone. No applause, no medal, sometimes not even a question. And yet showing up again still matters because presence, even without recognition, is its own refusal. In psychology, this connects to the idea of behavioral persistence, the ability to act without external reinforcement. Most people only continue when there is a reward, but when you can keep moving without an applause, you already crossed into a different level of resilience. You stop trading effort for validation. You start moving for function. History is full of quiet returns. Think of the men and women who came back from exile, not with banners, not with plans. Writers finishing their work after years in silence, leaders walking back into hostile cities, ignored by the crowd, but sharper than before. Their comeback wasn't measured by noise, it was measured by accuracy. That's the thread in this chapter. Still showed up, not because the system deserved him, not because there was a stage waiting. However, refusing to return would have handed the narrative to those who had written him off. Showing up became a form of protest, not loud, but undeniable. There's a strategy here. When you show up after being erased, you don't need to announce anything. Your presence itself disrupts the script. You continue what others assumed ended. You fill in the blanks where they left them. And in that persistence, you remind them that they don't control your timeline. But this posture isn't about bitterness, it's about leverage. Every time you return without applause, you strengthen the part of yourself that no longer craves applause. Every step taken in obscurity builds a discipline to act without reward. And that discipline is what separates temporary survival for long term control. So, here's the question. When you return to a place that forgot you, do you shrink because no one noticed, or do you treat your return as proof that you no longer need their notice at all? She didn't leave all at once. She just stopped asking the second question, stopped offering the third reply, stopped waiting for himself to answer in full. It wasn't spite, it was slow recalculation. She saw the version of himself that wouldn't stay long, even if he stayed around. Thought he was hiding it well, but the absent in himself had already started speaking louder than the words he said. When someone stops reaching out, they already made a peace with your exit, even if you haven't. She gave signs. He wasn't deaf, just detached. There were moments, small hesitations, delayed responses, a different kind of smile. The one that isn't for you anymore. She asked questions, answered with deflection. She told stories he only half remembered. She reached out while staying seated, and eventually, she adjusted. When someone stops reminding you they care, they likely done it too many times already. There wasn't a fight, no raised voices, no door slammed, just a gap that didn't close. It stayed wide for days, then weeks, then he stopped noticing. That's how most things break, not from impact, but from friction left unattended. She left before she had to. That's what he respected most. Some people stay to argue, some stay to be proven right. She didn't. She saw he was already gone, and she made sure she didn't waste the exit. Not every ending is sudden. Some break quietly, long before the exit is official. This chapter isn't about betrayal or anger. It's about distance that arrives one small adjustment at a time. The second question was left unasked, the slower reply, the shift in tone that says more than the words. Psychology calls this emotional recalibration. People don't always leave out of spite. They leave because the weight of holding someone else's collapse becomes heavier than what they can carry. She didn't turn cruel. She just stopped reaching for what was no longer there. And that choice was less about her leaving him and more about protecting herself from disappearing too. History has always had these signs. Empires collapse when allies stop showing at the table. Partnerships fracture not with a declaration, but the slow refusal to invest. The signs are visible long before the final break. And those who pay attention knows that endings rarely come from impact. They come from friction left unattended. What makes this chapter sharp is the restraint. There's no fight, no dramatic split, no spectacle. Just the quiet recognition that sometimes the most respectful exit is a clean one. She didn't demand proof. She didn't beg for change. She understood that he was already gone and she left before resentment could poison what remained. Strategically, that's a lesson. Knowing when to step away without noise, without trying to force a repair, requires clarity that most people never learn. Staying longer doesn't always mean loyalty. Sometimes staying longer only creates more damage to sweep up later. The weight here is simple. Not everyone who leaves does so out of failure. Some leave because they've seen through enough to know what's coming. Some exits aren't abandonment, they're foresight. So, here's the question. When you sense that a bond is already thinning, do you hold on tighter out of fear or do you respect the signs and step out because the fracture turns toxic?